be an adventure. I really feel like I should be singing karaoke now.
Is it on?
I'm not going to.
It's not working.
No.
It is working. Can you hear me better with the microphone than you could without it?
Hold it close to your mouth.
Am I holding it close enough to my mouth now?
Yeah.
And tipping it? All right. I hope everyone, can appreciate the modeling, and okay, we'll see how this goes. My name's Kellar. I'm the executive director for the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. We are working in close collaboration these days under the banner of Democracy Maine, but we are still, at the same time, the League of Women Voters that is about to celebrate its 100th birthday. Wow. In the next year. And as we're thinking about anniversaries, it is a chance for us to take stock, to look at where we've been coming from, all of the good and the bad of the past, and really think about what we want our next 100 years to be like. So I'm really glad to have you all here with us for the first of what we hope are many conversations over the course of the next year and a half of going through an anniversary that is both our anniversary, Maine's anniversary, the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. There's a lot of anniversaries that are happening. And I want to start us off by reading something that Brent Staples wrote in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. Quote, "Americans are being forced to choose between a cherished lie and a disconcerting truth as they prepare to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment in 2020. The lie holds that the amendment ended a century-long struggle by guaranteeing women the right to vote. The truth is that it barred states from denying voting rights based on gender, but guaranteed nothing." End quote. So as we begin to celebrate the centennial, we want to hold conversations that grapple with the disconcerting truth. We know that the passage of the 19th Amendment was a partial victory, and most political victories are partial. And we have a lot to gain today from examining the shortcomings as well as the successes of that movement. We're part of a suffrage centennial collaborative with organizations around the state, and this is the attitude that this collaborative is taking. So as we're looking back on the achievement of the 19th Amendment, we're also reflecting on the difference between rights in law and rights in reality. It took nearly 100 years of courageous activism to pass the 19th Amendment, and it's taken 100 years more for women to begin to realize the full promise of that reform in representation and in election to high office. At the same time, in 1920, in most parts of the country, only white women could vote. It took another 45 years for African Americans to secure access to the ballot. Native Americans only gained that right in the 1970s, and the franchise is only beginning for them too when it comes to political equality and representation. We know that the work is not done, even when it comes to voting rights. In many parts of the country, too many people are disenfranchised as a result of ID laws, restrictive voter registration, and our racially biased judicial system. One way to tell the story of America is as a quest for universal suffrage for all of our people. And that movement has always been intersectional. There are histories of solidarity and of partnership, and there also are histories of compromise, division, and groups of Americans being told to wait their turn to fully participate in American ideals. Our Constitution says that all men were created equal. That is the promise of America, but there's also a glaring problem in the second word of that statement. The struggle for women's equality, an acknowledgement that women have an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, continues to this day, as does the fight against the other injustices that were built into the Constitution. Slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise, the violent displacement of Native American sovereignty, property requirements to vote, the fight to right these wrongs also continues today, and we're committed to using the 19th Amendment centennial as a reason to have conversations like this, to learn from each other so that we can all move forward for a country that respects everyone's rights. So I am so thrilled, and I'm going to sit down now that I've given you all a speech. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with some really eminent panelists today. And now I'm going to look at my
Great
folder,
speech, by the way.
realize that I have the wrong folder, and ask someone, because I know you all have carrying around this folder, to give me the sheet with everyone's bios so that I can read it. Does anyone have that?
You want us to just introduce ourselves? We've got a quick.
You're welcome to introduce yourselves.
Here it is.
Why are we good? Thank you. I'm holding a folder of testimony from last week, which is really great. So starting on my far left, Maulian Dana is the tribal ambassador for the Penobscot Indian Nation. She educates on issues facing her people and acts as a diplomat on behalf of the nation in local, state, and federal government. She focuses on matters of advocacy for tribal sovereignty and has an activism background dealing with, quote, Indian sports mascots, seeking to unpack the barriers those stereotypes can set up between races. And Maulian is also the proud mother of 2 daughters, Carmela and Lila. Reverend Kenneth Lewis is the senior pastor of the historic Green Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Church in Portland and is the former vice president of the Greater Portland NAACP. Reverend Lewis serves as board vice chairman of the Harriet Tubman Home and works locally to promote racial and economic equity consistent with Dr. King's vision of the beloved community. Welcome, Reverend Lewis. And Ann Gass is the author of Voting Down the Rose, Florence Brooks' White House and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage, a book about her great-grandmother's leadership of Maine's suffrage battles in the final years of the campaign. She is a frequent lecturer on suffrage history at libraries, historical societies, and high schools, and was also our keynote speaker at last year's Peace of the Capitol event, where we were so excited that we had to have her back this year. So I'm really excited about this conversation, and I first just wanted to set the stage and get us somewhat on the same page with the history that we're discussing, to ask each of you to give us a few of the key points in the history of voting rights and the fight for the vote in your communities, and start in this direction to start with.
Okay, sounds good. So the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and that was 133 years from the time that the Constitution was first adopted, and 72 years from the Seneca Falls Conference in Western New York that a lot of people sort of date the organized suffrage activity from. So those are long stretches of time. It was hard work. There was no guarantee of success, and even up until the last state was ratifying, they didn't know, whether or not they would get it done. It came down to Tennessee, a southern state, and one legislator who voted in favor of it. So I guess I just wanted to sort of put the vote in a broader context, because I think sometimes we hear, oh, women got the vote, in 1920. Women got nothing, and they won the vote in 1920 after a lot of hard work. And I just do want to go back over the language of the 19th Amendment, which is the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And so they laid the foundation for all women eventually being able to vote, even if it didn't happen in 1920.
So I'm going to riff off that a little bit, because I think that language said citizen. Dred Scott said I was not one. Embedded in the Constitution of the United States, it says that people of African descent are 3/5 for tax purposes and representation in the South in order to sustain a power position. So when the 19th Amendment was enacted, it took the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and all of the black codes within the South that continued to deny access the ballot or the box. And so when I think about suffrage, I think about the suffering of persons who were here long before others were here and were denied citizenship rights. And over again in our legal documents, it refers to citizens, of which I was considered not one. And so how do you, quote unquote, clap that back when you have a system designed to suppress and repress people? And so when I think about voting rights, I think about it broadly in that context, and that's what I hope to bring to the conversation.
All right, well, thank you for having me here today. I'm really glad to be here. I'm a member of the Penobscot Nation, which is kind of north of Bangor. We're one of the 5 tribes of Maine. So I was excited to come speak about this today because I really do think we need a lot of voices in this conversation when we're talking about voting rights and citizenship. And we need to understand how history impacts our present and how the effects of the generational trends affect us all sitting here today, and how we all embrace our realities. So I'm not a historian, and if I use dates, I'll probably get them wrong. So I'll talk mostly in concepts. And I think when you talk about Native American people in a conceptual way in this country, there's this notion of the indigenous nations being in the way, being something to colonize in order to progress as a country, and in order to claim this land as something new, and that is America. So then they have this quote-unquote Indian problem. You know, what do we do with them? Do we integrate them? Do we try to make them something they're not? And the citizenship and voting rights is the perfect way to kind of showcase that, because we saw that kind of forced assimilation. Let's just try to blend them in. We don't want them to be their own sovereign places. And then when the tribal nations, didn't respond to that very well, those of us that were left, there was this sort of like, well, we'll involve them, but we'll do it by a state-by-state basis. So even though there was the Snyder Act that kind of granted voting rights federally to Native people, each state had to ratify their own system of doing it. And I believe Maine was, it was one of the last ones. I think the last one was 1962, so Maine was like late 50s, I believe. So I was born in 1984, so I think about my parents and my grandparents, and it's really not that long ago, and we haven't had this right for all that long. So glad to be here too.
Moving from the broad to the specific, who is a hero of yours in the struggle for equal rights that we should know more about? And I'll ask you to start.
So it's probably a good way to blend into the person I wanted to talk about, and that would be my grandmother. Her name is Elizabeth Sockbeeson, and she is a Penobscot citizen as well. And my grandmother is 80. Don't tell her I told you. So she was born in 1938, 38. So when you think about, the snapshot in time of how long Native people have had the right to vote, she went a lot of her life, or some of her voting life without that right. So to think about being a person indigenous to this land and not being seen as an equal or a citizen or someone worthy of rights and recognition is pretty daunting. And my grandmother was born into poverty, a very young mother. Her mother died in her 30s of tuberculosis. My grandmother was raised, in some different homes and ended up having a very strong Catholic faith because she was taken in by a convent, and just very, very humble beginnings. And my earliest memories of her was working for the Penobscot Nation as a director of housing, and she kind of had this very nice little career. She had raised 8 children, very strong woman, lived through the passing of one of her children, and I've always admired her so much. And she was what gave me kind of one of my first sparks to get into politics, because she has served on the tribal council since the 70s. And she very, very much cares about our home and cares about the world around her and how she's leaving this place for future generations. So I think about a woman with not much reason to care about kind of the broader thing beyond her home and her community. And she always very much has. You know, a lot of Indigenous people, before we were even citizens, were fighting as service members in every single war of this government. So, and it wasn't just kind of this, well, we're desperate, so we're looking for a place to make money and spend our time and someone to take care of us. There's a real want to serve and protect the country, even though they didn't see them as equals. So I think about my grandmother, Elizabeth Sockbeeson. She recently retired from tribal council, but she's trying to get back on it. a whole other story that my mother is not crazy about. But what is it in us, you know, that drive to care, even when the odds are so stacked against us? So, you know, what is that chip that says, I see the barriers we're putting up, and not only am I going to get over them, I'm going to teach you why I got over them, and I'm going to show you the way, instead of letting that be a barrier between our races and our different groups and stuff. So she has inspired me a whole lot, and I see in the span of her life how the country has changed a lot. And I have a quick little story. We went to Washington, D.C. in 2005 to see the opening of the Smithsonian Native American Museum. And the day before, we toured the Holocaust Museum. And it really affected me, and you know, it's intense to go through there. It took me a long time to get through. And I was talking to my grandmother, and I said, I don't know if I can handle seeing our history. It's going to be so raw and so real. And then after we went to it, I was so disappointed. I found it candy-coated and sanitized, and it didn't tell the whole story. And I didn't share that with her because she seemed pretty impressed by it. So we were telling the stories later, and they said, well, Beth, what did you think of the museum? Oh, it was great, and Maulian loved it, and it was awesome. And I said, no, actually. I kind of had my own take. So she had a discussion with me after that. She goes, you know, I'm of the age where I've been comfortable with what the government tells me to believe about things, and I've been comfortable with not telling the truth because it makes the powers that be feel more comfortable all around, you know. So we had some good discussions about how we identify as Indigenous people and how we collectively as a society look at the real history and the real trauma, and we're only going to ever move forward in a real way if we recognize those realities. Long answer to that question.
So I decided to go back to my hometown, which is Boston, and to find a historical figure that no one else knew. Studied up on her a little bit. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. She was an African-American publisher, a journalist, civil rights leader, suffragist, and she was the editor of the Women's Era, the first national newspaper published by and for African-American women. She supported women's suffrage in 1869, joined with Julia Ward Howe, you know that name? And Lucy Stone, you know that name too? Yeah. To form the American Women's Suffrage Association. She was one of the founders of that. She founded the New England Women's Club in 1868. Black weekly paper, The Current, she wrote for, and a member of the New England Women's Press Association. But what really drew my attention to her is that after organizing the National Federation of African American Women, she convened the first national conference of the colored women in America in Boston, which was attended by 42 black women's clubs from 14 different states. She went to a national meeting in 1900, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which really focused on suffrage. She went there as a representative of 3 organizations. 2 of the organizations were white. One of the organizations was African American, colored, black, or Negro, whatever phrase you want to use during that time. And she was not allowed to sit on behalf of the black organization, and she refused to be seated at all. So the complexity of suffrage, color still counts. And so while my friend and my sister here talked about the sugar coat, the candy coated, we can applaud and celebrate lots of success. But we can't forget that there's still something deeper and more insidious around securing full access and equity and equality, because this learned woman, her husband who died was a Harvard-trained lawyer, first African-American city councilor in the city of Boston, a judge, left her an estate, and she used all of her resources to educate and to seek equal rights for all through an integrated process. She integrated the women's suffrage movement, and she brought an experience and an exposure that needed to be listened to. But in 1900, she was refused a seat because of who she represented. Her name is Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Her father was one of the founding members of the oldest African-American church in Boston, which is now called the Columbus Avenue AME Zion Church, which has history with the Green Memorial AME Zion Church, same denomination. That's why our church has been known throughout its 200 plus years as the Freedom Church.
So mine's cheating a little bit because I did write a book about her, but my great-grandmother was actually kind of lost to history. Her family, even her family had not learned about or remembered any of her suffrage activity and leadership there. And she'd been written out of Maine's suffrage histories because of her more radical beliefs. I mean, I say radical was very gentle. She believed that it was okay to picket President Wilson at the White House gates and to even burn him in effigy if it came to that, you know. And so she wasn't going around blowing up buildings, but that was pretty radical for conservative Maine at that time. And really just anybody who works for a cause that's unpopular with their peer group, whatever that might be, their employer, their church, their community, their women's club, whatever. It's hard day after day to keep that fire going, kind of like what you were saying. How do you do that when the world around you disapproves and doesn't see your vision for change? But at the same time, I mean, the women and men who worked for women's suffrage they were perhaps our heroes, but they weren't superheroes. They weren't always right. They were as racist as their time, which was pretty racist, and they fell into the same sort of belief traps that everybody else did at that time. So I think it is really important to acknowledge that. My great-grandmother, in addition to the suffrage stuff, also was really concerned about labor and working girls in factories and making sure that women who had families and worked had paid time off after they had babies and things like that. So even though she herself was a woman of privilege who didn't need to work outside the home, she did spend quite a bit of time trying to understand kind of what the rest of the world looked like and come up with laws and regulations that help them live more comfortable lives.
Thanks. And I think you've already touched a little bit on this, Anne, but if you could go back in time, you're fortunate that you don't have to go back in time to talk to your grandmother, but if you could ask your hero a question, what would you want to know? And particularly, they make a decision that you wish that they'd done differently or that you see differently standing where we do in the 21st century.
I think I've been thinking about this a lot lately in the context of the centennial and the discussion that we're at last having about the people who weren't really enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. I certainly would want to know, were you in touch with the black leaders in Portland at the time, and what did you consider them, did you involve them at all, did you meet with them even? And if not, kind of why not, what was your thinking? I mean, I suspect, I haven't come across anything in the Portland newspapers of the time or in her papers that references this, so it doesn't seem as though she did. But that certainly would be something I'd want to know more about. To what extent were you actively thinking about trying to get the Southern senators to sign on to this 19th Amendment and get it through Congress, which is kind of where they were getting to in 1918, 1919. It was very much a political decision for a lot of people, as sort of reprehensible as it was in retrospect.
Well, what could I say to Josephine? When I consider the level of African American women voting, I think Josephine would be proud. A lot of things changed because African American women go to the polls. And so I think she would view that as a success. But I think I'd probably ask her, how could you do this with such success, with such tenacity, and to maintain what I would call permanent interests, not permanent friends or permanent enemies, but permanent interest. Because sometimes I think in circumstances like this, one day one is our friend, the next day they're on the other side of the ledger. Back then I'm sure she was a Republican and she wasn't a Democrat back in the early 1900s, which tells you that nothing is permanent. Hello, somebody, if I was in church. Nothing's permanent. Her interest remained permanent. And so she was able to navigate the changes in time. How can you teach us to effectively navigate political landscape changes and stay on point? Not forget the issues and the permanent interests of securing whatever it is someone is seeking to secure.
Well, yeah, it's a little different for me since my grandmother's alive, but did I mention she had 8 kids and I can barely keep up with 2, so I'd probably ask her some stuff about that. I think something that I turn to her a lot for guidance is Indigenous people were kind of stuck in this, how do we define our tribal sovereignty and how much are we willing to symbolically chip away at it if it means we look like we're advancing in other areas. I guess a good instance of this is we had a seat in the legislature here for quite some time, and it was a big deal to get that seat. That seat didn't have a vote that it carried, so they could work on committees and propose legislation, but they couldn't vote on it. And there's split feelings about that in our community, and my grandmother feels like it should have had a vote. My father, who used to be chief of the tribe Dana, feels very strongly it shouldn't have a vote because then it puts tribes at the same status as municipalities, and we need to act like a sovereign government. So that's one of the big things that I guess I grapple with every day in this work, and she's helpful just because she has seen so much. And I think, so the position of ambassador that I hold now is kind of the answer to that question a little bit. So we did pull a representative from the legislature in 2015, and now I've had this position for about 1.5 years now. So we're still working out the kinks, I guess, and how much of a presence we want to have in Augusta, and what things we need to weigh in on, and how we're going to write bills. And we do have, I think, 17 bills in this session that have to do with tribal issues with all the tribes of Maine. So that's something that when we think about citizenship and representation and visibility, you can see the tribes in the media and what we're doing and stuff, but always remember that we're constantly grappling with trying to state who we are as a people and keep that sovereign identity and mission going and trying to find our way kind of in this other world. So that's something I look to her a lot for.
So in reading up on history, I was pointed to a speech given in 1866 by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a leading African-American poet, lecturer, and civil rights activist at the time, and she addressed the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York and said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." And that statement really resonated with me, especially thinking about how politics can require compromise, and compromise that usually comes at the expense of those who have the least power. And so I wanted to ask our panelists to reflect on a time in your experience or in the history that you've studied where had to weigh whether to compromise on universality in order to achieve some progress. Whoever would like to go first here.
It's your turn to go first.
My turn to go first. Frederick Douglass said, "Where there is no struggle, there can be no progress." And so that statement kind of bound up into a bundle of, and I can't quote it, it's hard to be satisfied with small steps that take generations to achieve and or acquire. It's painful to think about what my parents and or grandparents or ancestors had to deal with. In Massachusetts, my family is Wampanoag Chappaquiddick, an African American. And I have no idea what they had to deal with. I mean, Native and African American in the 1700s and the 1800s, and I can date my family back to 1750s. In Massachusetts, before there was a country. And just to think about what I'll call the minuscule amount of progress over 260 years. It's just hard to think about compromise. Am I going to compromise my soul? What am I compromising? You know, I suffer so that maybe someone else doesn't. I don't know how fair that is in life. And so, you know, that's a hard question for me to answer. It's just a very difficult, what should I give up? What should I be called to give up? You know, if an aspirational statement that was, should I ever step back from that and say, I'm going to be satisfied? The answer is no. And so this unsettling dissatisfaction, I think it's there to propel people forward. And have a party for one night and then go back to work the next day, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I probably answered this a little bit in my previous answer on a kind of broader level, but I like the quote a lot, and I reflected on this quote, and I think I do a lot of work with the Indian mascots, and I've been at this since I was 15 years old. I was watching the Skowhegan Indians play the Nokomis Warriors on TV when I was in high school, and they came out and they had the feathers and the war paint, and they're like hopping around and they're banging fake drums. And I looked at my father and I said, what the hell is this? I said, is this what people think we do? Is this what people think we are? You know, I've been raised up until this point that all that stuff's sacred. You know, that's religion. That's, that's our grounding, source is those feathers and the dress and the ceremony and all that. So that sparked something in me that I became a peer educator. I talked to other high schools about my reaction to these mascots, and at the time, I wasn't, evolved or mature enough to see it much more than, well, I'm angry and it's wrong and it's disrespectful. So throughout this 20 years or so that I've been at this, I've come to learn just how the effects are psychological and how they're harmful, and how the stereotypes are really a spoke and a wheel of oppression. And it's connected to our struggles for sovereignty. It's connected to how we are viewed as less than human. I mean, we had the President of the United States make a Trail of Tears joke last week on Twitter. That's how you talk about when you get frustrated about progress not being made. So it's all related, and it does have implications on policy and how we live our lives and everything. So in our work at Wells High School last year or so, the year before, they had this warriors imagery where they had the feathers and all that sort of thing. And a mother who's from the Mi'kmaq tribe who had a son playing on an opposite team, her son was getting taunted by the players on the Wells team, and they were beating drums at him and wearing the feathers and all that sort of stuff. So it started this kind of public case, I guess, about the mascot, and we had a committee that met with their committee, and we talked about why these images are harmful. We're at the point where there's a bulk of scientific data and research, so it's not just hurt feelings or political correctness at this point. It's these mascots lead to a learning environment for all children that promotes harmful ideas and behaviors, and they do contribute to racism and bigotry and all that sort of thing. So in the Wells discussion, this person in the town said, well, I knew an Indian family that lived in Wells, and they loved the mascot. They thought that it represented who they were, and they were proud of it, and they were proud to be included in our town and all this sort of thing. So we actually had a lady on the panel whose father was in that family, and she said, no, you're wrong. She said, we were terrified. She said, we were trying to fit in. She said, we had to run our moccasin business, and we needed business to run our household, and we needed the money. So she goes, we weren't proud of it, but we pretended that we were okay with it. So when I thought about that quote, I thought about, you sacrifice a little bit of that pride. And what is that doing through the years when you're swallowing that, when you're playing along, when you're letting people steal your identity and call themselves Indians? In Skowhegan, a man came up to me and said, I'm just as Indian as you are, and Skowhegan is my tribe. And I think about how much it would crush my soul to say, you know what, you're right, I'm sorry. I just want to blend in here, I'm sorry. We're Indians, me and you. So that quote made me think about that, and how when we're not privileged enough to I think there's a privilege in not having to see those kind of situations where your safety or your livelihood might be at stake. So that's what that made me think of, that kind of sacrifice.
Yeah, as a white woman of privilege, I haven't had the experiences my co-panelists have had, or that history, and I haven't been involved in personally in a political decision where it was kind of universal versus this special interest group. But I think, as a society, we make choices all the time, and they're kind of expressed through our budgets, or how whether it's budgeting our time or budgeting our financial resources. We always choose to include some groups, exclude others, in order to focus on getting some piece of work done. So I do think that's sort of ingrained in our society. What that means, of course, is that when you're the people in privilege, you're the privileged people and you're the decision makers, you get to leave the others out and make sure that your own people are well taken care of. And that's certainly the history that we've seen over from the start of this country and beyond.
Okay. I kind of want to get into this. It's ingrained, this privilege, and generations downstream don't even recognize it. And so any type of, it's just how it is,
Yeah.
right? And this is just how it's supposed to be. And so there's no second thought until someone is shocked to hear someone else's story, right? And I think that's an important piece. What does the majority have to give up? Because oftentimes, it's the marginalized that's asked to wait, the marginalized is asked to compromise, to give up. And really all that does, it exacerbates the power and the privilege of the majority. And so we shouldn't ask those who are marginalized to wait or to take small steps or to say society's not ready for this radical change. And so, you know, that's just something that struck me as everyone began to share.
Well, yeah, we're actually gonna get into this in the next question, so maybe I'll.
Thank you, I think that's so important.
It is.
So I wanted to get a little bit into some of the questions about strategy and tactics that we're starting to come to. And I think there's often a tension in movements between fighting for legal rights versus changing the culture, and sometimes have to decide about prioritizing one over the other versus trying to go for both at the same time. And hoping you could reflect a little bit on that balance or tension between cultural change, changing hearts and minds about who deserves to be seen as an equal human being, and then the process that can often be so slow of trying to win legal and political change.
In 2018, I decided to run for state rep for my district, and I was unsuccessful at that, but I was talking to you know, the local groups who help nurture new women candidates, and I was really struck by what I was told, which was that, you know, for women who are running for office for the first time, especially if they haven't done anything at the local level, they spend a lot of time overcoming internalized misogyny. And I just thought that in 2018, that was such an interesting statement. And I see that playing out, that internalized misogyny and the misogyny expressed in our town and in our state and federal government, in our executives. You know, over the last several years, I've really seen that expressed. And the fact of the matter is that women have, you know, are continuing to try to overcome centuries of misogyny, and that goes back to the earliest beginnings of the Christian church, and it's sort of enshrined in our culture and in our laws, and it's taken a really long time to even get to the point where we are now. And in 1920, although women got the vote, that was really just a milestone along the way. There were so many other rights that women didn't yet have, and it took another 50 years and more. It wasn't until the 1980s that the Supreme Court, for example, ruled that it was illegal to sexually harass women in the workplace. And in fact, the case they brought was an African-American woman who had been raped, you know, repeatedly by her boss over many years. You know, it was until the 1970s the Supreme Court said, you know what, states, you've got to make sure that there's a way for women to serve on juries, because not every state had done that. And you know, so many laws and regulations that were put in place because it was kind of the way things were done. And so that struggle continues for all women. It's much more difficult for women of color and immigrant women, of course. And so that struggle continues.
1920 to 1965. You have the 19th Amendment, and then you have the Civil Rights Act. And in between that, you have the Civil Rights Movement, following the Niagara Movement and everything else. And so, you know, winning hearts and minds is that's nice, that's important. But having strategies that puts laws on the books and those laws are enforced is very important. I mean, it's absolutely essential that there are multi-fronts to this battle. And a common term used in this day and age is called allies. Allies fight together. Allies, half of the allies can't win. If you go back to another context, World War II or whatever it might be, everybody has to win. We all have to be on the same team. And we have to have a strategy that we agree upon. And then we have to implement that strategy on many different fronts. And so I think it's important that we remain consistent and vigilant on implementing the strategies. So I tell people all the time, I'm not the big bullhorn guy. You know, I can march, but I get a little tired on the way, I'm sure. I'm much better in a meeting room, in a small group like this, having a conversation. We need everyone to participate and everyone to know their role and everyone to do their job. Patriot fan I am, do your job. Patriot fan I am, do your job. And then maybe we'll win at the end if we continue to do our job and know what it is. But I think you always have to operate on both of those fronts, 1920 to 1965, and even post 1965, nothing was guaranteed. So.
Yeah. Super Bowl champion.
That's right.
I think at the heart of politics as we know it is how do you make people care? And that care takes different forms. Some politicians might only care about getting reelected or making their district or their state or their county look good. So we may see people taking on these causes that they don't necessarily care about, but if it means if people in their district care and their constituency will support them more, then cool. You know, so allies are important. You know, when we have these ends that we want to get to, the means can be kind of spreading the word through these allies, and they're the people voting for the people higher up and all this sort of thing. So I think as far as strategy, the hearts and minds are always great because that's how you knock on that door to get your network going, and you got to take the other approach too, where you're going up the chain. I get to testify every year to the Appropriations Committee in Congress on behalf of the tribe, and it's kind of a hilarious process. You have a certain set of time, and you get all this testimony, and you got to read it over and over and over again, and you have to say it as quickly as possible, but clearly, and we have a very great relationship with Representative Pingree, so she always gives me some nice questions, we can get a little more time, and it's just so funny. I think about it after, and I said, these are the halls where so much of America happens, and it's so much about what are you going to say that's going to make them care. We have a disaster with opioids in our community, so you have to read these statistics, and it's people it's my cousins, it's my friends, it's people I grew up with, and they're dying. They're dealing drugs, they're using drugs, they're dying from it. But I have to sit there and say the statistics and put it forth in a way where, give us some money, care about this. So I think that's the ultimate thing, is making people care, even if it's not coming from the most genuine altruistic place in that person. How do you get them from A to B? So say, right now in this legislature, we're going to have an act to ban Indian mascots, and we have an act to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. If you would have told me, if you would have told me as a high schooler out, talking to kids, and I tell this one little story. I went to Scarborough High School, and they were the Redskins, and I usually don't use that word, but it's for the sake of the story. And I went into their gymnasium, I'm like 16, 17 years old, and every single kid is in there in their jersey, and they booed me because they knew I was there to talk to them about their mascot. So if you would have told me then that someday we'd be getting state of Maine lawmakers to look at this very real policy, and we're making a lot of progress on it, then I would have thought you were crazy because nobody really cared. So something happened throughout these past couple of decades that has gotten people to caring, and whether that's seeing the effects of mascots and different sorts of things, hearing personal testimony of how it makes Indigenous people feel when you see people celebrating Columbus Day, and seeing that painful reminder that we were targeted for genocide, and that these aren't just kind of fluffy things that nobody needs to worry about in their day-to-day life. So I think for me, there's many ways to get there, and you, like you said, Reverend, you really need to be working them all.
I'm a real fan of Frederick Douglass, if I could, and said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so there has to be a demand, even if it's not popular. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think that we have to continue to demand change.
Can I get a time check from you, Reverend?
It is 3:20
3:20.
on my
All right.
watch,
We're doing
and
great. We're doing so well.
3:21 on my phone. So.
I was going to ask another question about tactics, but I feel like I could not possibly put it better than Frederick Douglass. And I do want to give a chance for a couple of questions from our group.